to have the opportunity to work and celebrate on this land. Oh. You could hear me before, right? I was fine. Okay. So now I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie. Stephanie Savage is a Cinema Studies and Innis College alumna. Stephanie is a co-founder of the production company Fake Empire, and she is a Canadian screenwriter and television producer known for her work on The OC, Gossip Girl, The Carrie Diaries, and much more. Woo!
Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm fighting emotion as I stand up here looking out at Rebecca's beautiful family. So grateful for everyone who could gather today, college friends, New York friends, people who didn't know Rebecca but have read the book and loved it or are curious about it, Toronto publishing people who supported Rebecca early in her career and in the launch of Peggy. And to Innis College, who are hosting this event, and to our panelists who have come, and saying hello to Rebecca's family in Victoria, her mom and her brother who are back there. I hope you enjoy tonight. It's very special. We all love the book. And it seemed like it would be appropriate to start the night with a little video put together by a University of Toronto alum with a passion for Peggy. Hella will introduce herself in the video, but I think it's very special. Thank you.
My name is Hella Wiedmer-Newman, and I am a doctoral candidate at the Icona Center for the Theory and History of the Image in Basel, Switzerland. My research concerns the visual memorial politics produced within the post-conflict protectorate of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But for the purposes of this talk, I, like many a young, intrepid art historian, was once an intern at the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice. In the spring and summer of 2017, just as the museum's direction was passing hands from Guggenheim's old friend Philip Rylance to her granddaughter Carol Vale, I was daily making my way to the Palazzo Venier de Leoni to learn and teach about this remarkable collection of modern art and its fearless patron. The thing that always struck me about both Guggenheim and her collection is that she didn't only have an uncanny sense for works that would become defining for their period, and especially representative of her twin interests, surrealism and abstraction, but that she was very good at telling a larger story about modern art and at bringing the art closer to the viewer. While running her first commercial gallery, Guggenheim Jeune, which, if you've already read Rebecca Godfrey's marvelous book, you'll know opened in 1937, Guggenheim was in fact planning, with her rigorous itinerary of buying one painting a day, to amass a collection of modern art for the city of London. However, with the outbreak of the Second World War, she was forced to flee back to New York with a number of her artist friends and their creations, works the Nazis deemed degenerate art. At Guggenheim Jeune, then, she was experimenting with how to present and legitimate a collection of contemporary artworks, which was a novel endeavor in an art world still very much enamored of Impressionism. One of her first exhibitions introduced the UK public to the work of Yves Tanguy, my personal favorite in her collection. Here in Tanguy's 1931 Promontory Palace, you can see that he challenged strict surrealist tendencies with his technical precision and his evocation of desolate industrial landscapes, straddling the naturalistic and the surreal. To emphasize the value of works by the likes of Tanguy, Jean Arp, and Jean Cocteau, Guggenheim eschewed the classic salon hanging style, opting instead for the white cube look. But not everyone appreciated the artwork she was displaying. Indeed, when a British customs official refused to let her enter the country with works by Constantine Brancusi, Henry Moore, and Alexander Calder, instead classifying them as manufactured goods, which would incur an import tax, she took the case to the House of Commons and won, leading to a tangible change in the cultural understanding of art. Back in New York, her non-commercial gallery Art of This Century, which opened in 1942, introduced North Americans to the European art circle she had been moving in. Working with the avant-garde architect and set designer Friedrich Kiesler, she brought the paintings closer to the viewer by hanging them from pulleys that allowed them to be manipulated and inspected at close range. And the concave, darkly hued walls lent an intimately subterranean effect to the exhibition. Guggenheim believed that art was something to be lived in and with, and she made no distinction among art, craft, and utilitarian objects, as the chairs designed by Arp in the background here can attest. The works in her debut show were both isolated as singular entities and brought into a range of dialogues with one another, depending on which way one looked, as if to recount a multi-layered story of the art of the Western European interwar period. And in 1943, Guggenheim famously hosted Jackson Pollock's very first exhibition, thereby expanding her collection to include important works of abstract expressionism. Finally, in 1948, when she returned to Europe after the war, this time to Venice, she had the opportunity to display her collection at the Venice Biennale, in the Greek pavilion, to be exact, since the country was mired in civil war at the time. The city was remaking itself after the war and trying to re-cement its identity as an artistic and cultural hub. And Guggenheim, with a collection of work, this time from both pre-war Europe and post-war America, managed to turn the city and the Biennale into a purveyor of the new and contemporary. She collaborated with architect Carlo Scarpa on the exhibition layout, emphasizing the pavilion's architecture through exaggerated vertical hanging and even placing paintings directly in the corners of rooms. Now at the Peggy Guggenheim collection, which has been run by the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation since 1980, a year after Guggenheim's death, the museum tells from room to room the story not only of the transition of the center of the canonical Western art world from Paris to New York after the Second World War, but it paints a narrative arc, much the way Godfrey's marvelous novel does, of the first half of the 20th century and beyond, of political upheaval, of the cultural and artistic legacies of psychoanalytic theory, of the appropriation of art and material culture from the global south, of war and destruction, booms and busts, and of the accelerated expansion of consumer culture. Guggenheim was an idiosyncratic and powerfully vulnerable visionary and storyteller, both in her life and in her work. And Rebecca Godfrey, with the help of Leslie Jameson and many others, have more than done her legacy justice. Thank you very much for your attention and happy reading.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Janet Somerville, and I'm going to be the moderator of tonight's panel, and I have the pleasure of setting up the first reading for you tonight from Rebecca's beautiful, aching, coming-of-age novel about the illustrious, indefatigable Peggy Guggenheim. This first reading is from early in Peggy's life. It's New York in the teens, and she's played hooky from school with some of her classmates, and they're watching a suffragist parade in New York. And our reader tonight is the celebrated award-winning actor Christine Horne, who was most recently here in Toronto on stage in Annie Baker's play, Infinite Life. Welcome, Christine.
Then women appeared, first as a haze, a mirage, low clouds in the sky. As the rowdy parade moved up Fifth Avenue, I saw more clearly the unlikely sight of hundreds of women in white Victorian dresses on white horses. They took over the street, waving violet banners, boisterous, forceful despite their delicate dresses, ruffled and abundant. A poem more than a procession, the newspaper would later say. Girls not much older than me wore crowns and carried long golden scepters. A woman held her baby to her naked breast. Little girls twirled in wrinkled pinafores. The sun turned the sky pink. The slanting rays seemed to push apart the afternoon clouds and coldness. Men began to gather on the sidewalks, great lines of men in black overcoats and dark hats, framing the women like an unwanted border. Men yelled insults. We could hear their voices. "Go home, you harridans." 4 women held a stretcher, ballot boxes on the canvas bed instead of an invalid. "Vote," the banners said. A woman dressed like a valedictorian in a silk robe and scholar's hat raised her hands, and I imagined she might have seen Faye and me, and her hands were gesturing toward us, beckoning. "Can we join them?" I asked Faye. "We must," she agreed, and we leaped from the tree, ran from the park into the parade. How easy it was to march alongside the women. We moved without fear that someone might spot us and say, "Aren't those the Jewish girls from Jacobi?" "We marry you, why can't we vote with you?" a banner said. Faye sang along with a song I didn't recognize, her voice carefree and raspy. I swung my arms, striding in my narrow skirt. After a few minutes of marching, violence broke out. A tussle, a spat. A young woman with a Wisconsin sash pushed a police officer. He pushed her. I could not see the precise movement of the fight, only the young woman falling to the ground, and more police rushing into the parade. Faye screamed, "Leave her alone!" The surge of white dresses, the shoving and trample. I tripped, fell forward, knees on the concrete, kicked by a hoof.
We'll hear again from Christine later in the program. Now I'd like each of our panelists to introduce themselves to you and tell you how Peggy came into their lives and how the novel has affected them. We'll start at the far end with Adam.
Thank you. I'm Adam Welch. I'm a curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, where I'm responsible for 20th century international art. I also teach here at U of T. I just came fresh from a seminar, so this feels very familiar. And Peggy, I think for me, and I'll answer first maybe as an art historian, and then second as a human. Not that art historians aren't, but I think Hella did a great job of giving us a kind of context for her achievements. And for me, she's always been the major cultural connector between Europe and the United States in the 20th century. I mean, that's really the role, is that she managed to be in both places at very opportune moments, and she made those links in a completely fearless way. I think as a person, and this comes through so strongly in Rebecca and Leslie's book, is her just fierce, sexually liberated, being. I think that that's something that also comes through in her biography so strongly, and maybe those things aren't separate. Maybe there are ways in which her championing avant-garde art and living her life in a truly radical way, I think, are linked.
Rosemary.
My name is this on? Yes. Oh. My name is Rosemary Sullivan. I've actually published 17 books, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, short fiction, travelogue. My most recent 2 books were a biography of the daughter of Joseph Stalin. I actually had a friend in London say, check the Toronto phone book. And I found out that one of Svetlana Aluliyeva, Stalin's daughter's friends, lived in Toronto and gave me access to Sasha Berdansky, Stalin's grandson. I met the CIA officer who got her out during her defection. And then the next book was The Betrayal of Anne Frank, a cold case investigation, which did have a very wide publication through 20 countries. My connection with Peggy Guggenheim is in some ways peripheral, though having read this book, She fascinates me, and I want volume 2 of this book. I wrote a book called Villa Herbel, World War II Escape and a House in Marseille. And it was about a man called Varian Fry, who, when the Nazis invaded France, organized a dinner party in New York. And the daughter of Thomas Mann was there and said, somebody has to go. Money isn't good enough. So they collected $3,000. He taped it to his leg and went off to save people. And one of the people who came to visit him was Peggy Guggenheim. He was looking for somebody to follow him because he wanted to take a leave to get back to New York. He had established something called the Emergency Rescue Committee. And he asked her, which of course was terrifyingly inappropriate. It was not, Marseille was not a place where a Jewish woman could run an emergency rescue committee. She had to get out. And in the process of getting out, she stayed at the Villa Herbel. She fell in love with Max Ernst. She got people out of Marseille, across the border, flying out of Portugal to the United States. So she was politically astute, heroic, as well as a visionary, and her eroticism is absolutely fascinating.
Doretta.
Hi, I'm Doretta Lau. I'm a writer of fiction. I have a short story collection, and I'm developing a TV show based on my novel. And I'm here sitting on the stage today because of Rebecca Godfrey's mentorship. So in 2001, she had her debut novel out called The Torn Skirt, and it was set in Victoria. And I don't know, for some of you, if you're from suburbs, smaller towns from around Canada, but for someone who studied, English literature and CanLit, up until this point, I had not experienced a book like this one, where a young woman's kind of like her dreams, her desires, her just like wanting to break free from convention was just shown on this page with such beauty that you could look at something that was like so cool, but bring this like powerful language to tell this story. And so it was that meeting of all the things like, in CanLit, but this like fresh contemporary vision. And so just reading Peggy, the novel, and just seeing Rebecca bringing her eye to the story, to just like go through a young woman's journey into coming into their own as this incredible figure that was so just like influential in writing and art. And to just see like, that start, that childhood, the kind of those things that as a teenage girl you start thinking about and just wondering your place in the world, and just seeing her capture all of that in this figure, and just there's this intimacy in how the voice that Rebecca inhabits, the voice of Peggy, you can just see the research that she's done to really create this thing where you forget that Rebecca didn't like live in the contemporary, like as a contemporary of Peggy, but there was never that moment where sometimes you read historical fiction where you think, oh, that wasn't it. It's like every moment just felt like I was like, I get to go behind the scenes into her mind, because it just felt just so, just like I could feel Rebecca's like love for Peggy, for her life, for her adventuring spirit, the way that she felt for so many just like writers and like artists and musicians and her friends. And I don't know, just like reading the book and just seeing her bring that and taking it from the teenage voice up until adulthood was just like such an incredible thing to experience. So yeah, without Rebecca, I would not be here, because I would not have written books. And just, yeah, she just opened like CanLit and made it feel welcoming for a young writer. So yeah.
It's a really wonderful, beautifully put comment, Doretta. I think one of the things that really interested me about this book was the early part of Peggy's life. And one of the things that you've touched on is how believable it was. I mean, many of the women in this audience will, including people probably on this panel, will remember the absolute angst of being a hormonal teenage girl and how awful and wonderful it is at the same time. And I think that's something that Rebecca absolutely nails in young Peggy in this book. And the other thing is, you know, she lived at such an extraordinary time. Let's not forget the fact that her father, Benjamin, died on the Titanic in 1912, that her sister Benita, her beloved older sister Benita, died in childbirth, that her younger sister Hazel threw her 2 young children off the top of a penthouse in New York, killing them. And so a lot of Peggy's life was full of grief. And I think one of the things she did with her grief was to find meaning in art that gave her a way to go out into the world and actually live. And maybe that's something, Adam, you might talk a little bit more about how the art affected her in that way. And maybe some of the artists in particular when we get to Paris and when she starts acquiring the pieces. This is later in 1937 for Guggenheim Jeune, how she built that collection. And she couldn't have done that without the death of her mother, right? It wasn't the Guggenheim money that built the collection.
Hear me still? Yeah, there we go. Yes, so I'd like to start a little bit earlier because I think these teenage years are really evocative in the book. Elsewhere in interview, she described her upbringing, as one might expect, as very bourgeois, very dull. She bristled against that in these beautifully evocative images in the book. I love this idea of at her debutante ball having these dead black birds fall from the ceiling. This also feels very teenage, regardless of your gender,
Very
wanting
emo.
to really kind of
Very emo.
very emo, exactly. Or shave your eyebrows, just shave your eyebrows, and all the girls at Jacobi would follow suit and shave their eyebrows too. But what really struck me, and this kind of resonated, was that her first kind of entree into the art world was actually through the bookstore, to the Sunrise Turn, right? So we get this really interesting description of her being taken there by her cousin, who's kind of underwriting this very...
Yeah, Harold Loeb, who actually was a friend to Hemingway, and there's a very famous picture of Hemingway in Pamplona with Harold Loeb, because Harold Loeb is one of the characters in The Sun Also Rises. So Peggy was connected to modernist writers too, and we should probably talk about James Joyce at some point as well. But yeah, Harold was her entree.
Was her entree into this world, and it was, in her early 20s, she went to this pretty experimental bookstore. There's this passage in the book where Marsden Hartley kind of makes a cameo, stops by. He's taking a painting to Gertrude Stein in Paris, and so she doesn't know who Marsden Hartley is, or probably who Gertrude Stein is at that point. But that's her first kind of taste. And then it's in the bookstore that she meets Lawrence Vale, right? I mean, that's the first kind of meeting there. So I feel like lots of folks who get into art through books. They get into art through sociability, through the people. And so I like how we get that kind of image of her as a teenager beginning to take steps into this, at that point, very distant, I think, art world, right? It wasn't something that was in New York. It was still very much centered in Paris.
And she talked about, too, how her family was just really interested in the old masters, right? The dusty old master paintings that were in their mansions. And how the new art that she was being exposed to really enlivened her experience in the world. Rosemary, you look like you're ready to say something.
Just that what impressed me was how willing Peggy Guggenheim was to drop the persona of the rich young heiress, get down on her knees, sort the books, clean the deliver, etc. It was very impressive the way she did that. And the idea that she could possibly somehow find her way into this world. She was feeling so insecure, and yet had the courage of running into her own fear. That's what.
Run into her own
Yeah.
fear, and she had considered going to university, but her sister Benita talked her out of it, said, well, we'll go to Europe together instead. We don't need to go to university. It's, so-and-so's baby was born with one arm, and the doctor said it's because she studied literature at Barnard. So Peggy thought, oh, okay, well, I'll go to Europe with Benita instead. But even before we get her to the Sunwise Turn, she ends up taking typing lessons. Do you remember that scene, Doretta? Do you want to talk a little bit about that scene?
Oh, I just was so taken with the fact that, Peggy is looking for a way out of just what everyone else is doing. It's like she's not ready to dip into that idea of like becoming a wife, becoming a mother. And, what does she do? She goes and she takes these typing lessons. And to just see that kind of her understanding of like class and the girls that were in the class with her, and just that they didn't want her to kind of like have this experience and have it be a good experience. And to just see that like she was brave enough to just like continue to go, and then from there kind of like take that leap to work at the bookstore. So it's very much that idea you're saying that, she's getting down and dirty, that she was willing to kind of participate in society in this way that wasn't just about like, like her family, her money, but that there was like a way where she was just really trying to like reach at something, to be a part of a community, to make things that, she's just having that first consciousness of like what it might be like to be creative, and that she's like, doesn't think that it's something for her, but that it's still kind of there, and she's like reaching for it in these very practical ways. And then we see, what she does like later on with connecting with writers and really just encouraging people and wanting these books to exist and these memoirs to exist.
Right, with Juna Barnes in particular, right, in Paris in the 20s when she's married to Lawrence Vale. We're skipping all over the place here. The book itself is so fluid and rich. As you're reading it, you really feel like you're living Peggy's life with her. One of the things I really loved about this book is how Rebecca writes about art. And there's a moment when she looks at her sister Benita, her favorite sister, her cherished older sister, who she thought was the best, the kindest of all of them. And she reminds her of a Fragonard painting. Do you remember that, Adam, when a young girl, I think it's young girl reading?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact Fragonard reference, but I think that there are ways in which art is used to kind of signpost throughout. So you mentioned earlier, Uncle Solomon of Solomon Art Guggenheim Museum was interested more in Rembrandt and Renoir and kind of these status pictures, more or less, at the time that the robber barons had been amassing, like Frick and others. And there's this recurring idea too of Peggy's mother having this very academic sounding portrait of the three daughters, right? That becomes a kind of touch point and almost something so cloying and so sweet that she's really pushing against. I think to answer your earlier question about arriving in Paris and moving into those art worlds, there's this amazing scene where she describes posing for those fabulous Man Ray portraits in that Poiret dress, and wrapping the kind of turban, and this self-fashioning that feels like it's so really this kind of moment of emergence for her, right? Like that in that dress, being photographed by Man Ray in Paris in the early 1920s is her.
When she's pregnant with Sinbad,
Exactly.
her first child.
Yeah.
And Berenice Abbott is the assistant photographer. And what I love about that moment, too, is how she brings Berenice forward, right? And then buys her first camera because she sees something in her innate talent that she wants to nurture, pissing Man Ray off in the process.
Absolutely, yeah. The other art connection in Paris is staying at the Plaza Athénée, she has these reproductions pinned up of these erotic murals from Pompeii, like really highly sexualized. And it's amazing to think of her in this like I can only imagine, very stuffy bourgeois hotel, and then pinned to the walls these graphic sexual images. And her mother kind of sees these and is like scandalized by them. But I think that's something. She was omnivorous. She, of course, later she would kind of champion Cubists, Surrealists. When she gets to New York, abstract expressionists, and we can talk about that later. But she's really kind of looking for references everywhere and acculturating herself as she arrives in Paris. So.
Young woman, absolutely. Rosemary, did you have something to add there?
No, I was going to switch the gears a little bit and say what fascinates me as somebody who writes biography is the difference between a novel, which is a biography, and a nonfiction biography. When you start out as a biographer, what you do first is you go to whoever the literary executor is to get permission to quote letters and unpublished stuff and whatever, and without giving them the assurance that they can read the book when it's done, because you don't want it to be acknowledged or whatever. And what I'm trying to find always in this book is the wonderful melding of the voice of Rebecca, of Peggy Guggenheim, of Leslie, and there's a moment at the end I just love, which is there's an article by Leslie talking about, Leslie Jameson talking about Peggy Guggenheim and the writing of this book by her friend Rebecca. It's in the New Yorker, and she says, when Peggy, Sam Beckett, Rebecca, and me were in the bed together trying to do this sex scene, it was a bit crowded.
That's a wonderful scene.
And so as a biographer, I know where a lot of this stuff comes from, because in her acknowledgement, Rebecca, which is published by Leslie, put in the book, she says she read Peggy Guggenheim's memoirs. She read the 2 biographies of Peggy Guggenheim. She read Deirdre Baer's biography of Beckett. Leslie was able to find little notes saying, check what the furniture would have been in the hotel in 1927. So the level of research that she's done in this book is wonderful. And the difference is with a biography, you always tell where your sources are, and you kind of say, you never make anything up. But of course, there's no such thing as the biography. It's a biography. It's an interpretation of a life. But for instance, with the bookstore, it was very funny when Peggy Guggenheim's family shows up, and they buy a whole hoard of books. And they're doing it because they need a decorative wall of books. They couldn't give they don't care what they are, but they have to be 60 books, and they have to be the right color and the right size and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, is that Rebecca or is that Peggy Guggenheim?
Well, yeah, and then the bookstore owner, too, is absolutely delighted, right? Because they have to sell 60 books a day to make ends meet in the Sunwise Turn. And those Guggenheim aunts come in and take books that haven't been selling, that have been on the shelves, that are out of date, and they're glad to get rid of the old stock.
Classics.
Right? There's old Poe, I think, Poe books, right?
8-volume set of Poe.
Yeah,
But nobody reads
wants.
anymore. So.
But the Guggenheims take it, and they take it out in a wheelbarrow that she borrows from the rug merchant in the next store. Yeah, it's really wonderful. There are really moments of hilarity and delight in this book, too, even though Peggy herself, part of her life story is that she feels like the family has been cursed, and she has her own reason for thinking that, and you can understand why she might think that, but there's still moments of great joy and delight as well. Doretta, can you think of an example of that?
I think really for me, one of the things that came through was that breathless feeling that you were hearing some really delicious gossip. And I think that was what it was, where it's just like there were moments where it's just like you know, you may not know all of the writers mentioned, you may not know all of the artists mentioned, but the way that they come across in the book, when you get little details, it just feels like you've called up your best friend, or you're having like a glass of wine after like a week, and it's just like, oh, you know, did you hear that so-and-so and this happened? And like that level of feeling that you're just like really just having the best conversation with someone, and that it's just like endlessly fascinating and interesting. I think like for me that really like came through that Rebecca had done so much research on every single person. I just imagine her just like reading the work, going to look at everything. It's just like beyond the biographies, the just like reading through all that nonfictions, visiting the archives and things like that, to just like find those like little details that like, this is why history is interesting. That, you know, it's like, sure, there's dates, there's all those things, but the thing that always is so fascinating is just like, you kind of do want to know what dress a person was wearing as they leaned over to make like a rude remark about, you know, some very famous person, and it's just like, oh, that famous person did that. And I don't know, like for me, like the amount of just like bringing together so many interests and pulling those threads together and just creating that like fictional magic, that really came through for me. Just like thinking, just like with the Man Ray scene, that, you know, like the way the dress was, but also like, you know, when with Abbott, just like this idea that I could just feel Rebecca's admiration for Peggy lifting up a woman to be like, this person's point of view deserves to be seen. And I just felt like that was just like such a Rebecca thing, that she was always going around finding women whose points of view that were, you know, meant to be seen. She would always just like call and be like, you know, there's this like, you know, this musician. Yeah, and you know, I hadn't heard of her at the time, and it was like Grimes's like first album. It's just like, and I was just like, you know, she's always just finding and calling and being like, I saw this, you know, wonderful movie, I read this book, and it was always just this delightful like new way of seeing things. And I think like in these moments when Rebecca was just like covering the people that Peggy reached out to, I could just like really feel like the things that she valued in like creating an artistic community, and that she was like really highlighting that in the novel of what Peggy did.
And I think this is why this novel is like a continuing bond with Rebecca herself. You know, it's not only this story of Peggy Guggenheim's life, or these parts of Peggy Guggenheim's life, and the great effect that she had on the modern art world, from Europe to New York City. I mean, nobody did what she did. But what Doretta was just saying, you know, it's you can feel Rebecca's way of being in the world herself through her characters. And I think that's a real gift, you know, to be able to pull a book off the shelf and immerse yourself in it and feel like you know about the person who wrote it, even though the book is not about them. Adam, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the specific art that Peggy acquired and the artists that she championed at a time when nobody was championing them?
Yeah, absolutely.
She was fearless.
Before I do that, I want to pick up on Doretta's great point on gossip and how it feels like the novel is like propelled by gossip in ways. And I thought a lot about this because a lot of, you know, I work a lot on queer art histories, you know, art history of women artists as well. I think that gossip is actually its history. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think when it's recorded, when it comes down to us, it can become
it's a real grist.
Yeah.
Right?
It can really become the substance of something significant. And I think that often that's the case with marginalized folks, where like you're not written into mainstream history, so the gossip is what survives or comes down to us. And it might be slightly, you know, slightly skewed, but it still is something precious. And I feel like registering all of that in the book becomes really magical. Like, as you say, it's a really evocative part of the way it's written. To answer your question about the art and artists, so you know, Peggy's, as Hella did such a great job explaining, Peggy's collecting really picks up in 1938, astonishingly, when she opens Guggenheim Jeune gallery. She has, again, as Hella said, a kind of plan to build a museum in London. That's the idea, is that she's thinking maybe out of competition or spite for her uncle, who is well underway building the Guggenheim Museum in New York, or planning for that.
Sidebar too, the Kandinsky situation too, while we're at it. Yeah, I just think it's a good time to talk about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so she teams up with Herbert Reed, who at the time is a fairly influential editor of the Burlington magazine, which is a really kind of mainstream but very well-respected periodical. And Herbert Reed drafts a list of basically the most important 20th century artists that should be sought after. And so she goes to Paris on the brink of World War II in 1939, and this is where the picture a day anecdote comes to us. These are the days when she's going to Picasso's studio, she's going to Max Ernst's studio, she's going to Brancusi's studio, and she's just like voraciously collecting. She does most of it. By some accounts I've read, she does all of this collecting in this intense period for the amount of $40,000, which then, of course, was not insignificant. But given the collection is now worth billions, it seems like kind of the most astonishing foresight to be kind of like hoovering up what you could. I mean, it was very daring of her, because Entartete Kunst, the degenerate art show, was mounted by the Nazis in 1936, 650 works of art that were deemed degenerate. And she was collecting precisely these artists, right? She was kind of, I think, she knew which side of history she wanted to be on, and she was betting against that.
And would you say that she actually saved many works from destruction? And if she paid somebody $1,000 in 1937 for a work of art, that was enough money to get you out of Nazi Germany or France.
No, I think this is where the line is also quite interesting, because she not only is helping artists and dealers too by giving them the means to leave France, but then of course she personally helps Max Ernst, André Breton, the kind of more or less leader of one of the surrealist groups, emigrate to the United States with his family. But her role as patron, I think, is really something that also comes through in the book, with Juna Barnes, with
Emma Goldman.
Emma Goldman, exactly, yeah.
And we don't really get to Pollock, but she really was responsible for Pollock's career, was she not?
Yeah. We're kind of jumping ahead now to her New York years, when she establishes this very influential art of the century, this gallery space designed by Frederick Kiesler. We saw images of it, all these like kind of clays on poles that could be manipulated. You sit in an ARP chair. In terms of exhibition design, it's extraordinary. The lighting design was great. There was like intermittent sounds of an express train running through the gallery, just to like keep you on your toes, I guess. But one of the really important shows that she mounted there, yes, she gave first exhibitions to Rothko. This is in the early 40s. Rothko, Motherwell, Clifford Still, Jackson Pollock. But she also did what is, I think, I'm fairly certain there's consensus around this, the very first all-women show, 31 women, where she showed artists like Merritt Oppenheim, Dorothea Tanning, really...
I think there's an anecdote where she said, because Dorothea Tanning ended up with Max Ernst, right?
Yeah.
Who Peggy was married to at that time, and she said, I should have made it 30 women.
That's right, exactly. Dorothea, and that's how they met too, right? Max Ernst and Dorothea met at 31 women, so anyway. But I think this is, we could give a whole panel discussion of a kind of, I think these kind of friendships, sociability, but also these sexual relationships that she had that were so determining of her life, but also so astonishing for the time. I think they're really just,
Absolutely. She was so ahead of her time in so many ways. Rosemary, you wanted to say something?
Well, I want to say that she was the narrative of her time. I mean, she was born in 1898, right? And the first marriage to Lawrence Vail he was a sadist. She was beaten in very significant ways, and she had to find a way to get out of it. It took her quite a long time to figure out how to get out of that marriage. I think they were married for something like 6 years. For her to claim her own eroticism took a while. I mean, she had 2 children with Vale, and by the end of her life was complaining that she had failed in one thing. She'd been able to evolve herself. She'd been able to create a legacy through art, but she had failed her children. This is what she felt. And it amused me, by the end of her life, when she was 59 and in Venice, Rebecca ends the book, because Rebecca's a little bit, she's very sophisticated, Rebecca, in her reading of Peggy Guggenheim, frankly, because Peggy was not so liberated. She was the generation before Ursula Le Guin, who could say you have to have children to be an artist, right? So here she is in Venice at her museum, and Gregory Corso, who's 27, comes to visit, and she, 59, tries to seduce him. And it seems to me she's just flipped the position of the male artist and his privilege. The Max Ernst, the Picassos, etc. And she's still trying to find that space where we modern women, old ones like me and young ones like you, are still trying to ensure that we can have harmony in our relationships between the sexes, or between men and men, women and women, and so on. We're still working on that. And she, as it were, for me, lived the difficulty of it in her time. And Rebecca does that so well in that book. And again, what's shocking is that when Leslie picks it up, you can't find a difference between the 2 voices. I mean, the first 2 parts of the book are entirely Rebecca, it would seem, by Leslie's testimony in the New Yorker. But the 3rd part of the book seems to be somewhat, at least, directed by Leslie, and she gets it so smoothly. I just wish she would have gone on to the relationship between Max Ernst, Peggy Guggenheim during the war, all that stuff, fleeing from...
So much.
Yeah.
And I'm mindful of the time here, and we haven't even got to Beckett yet, and we do need to get to Beckett. She met Beckett in 1937 in Paris. Beckett was working as James Joyce's secretary. He was taking down the words to Finnegan's Wake. And as it turned out, Peggy's girlhood friend, Helen, was married to James Joyce's son, Giorgio. And so Peggy was happy to be reunited with her friend Helen in Paris. And she met Beckett at a party one night. And there's this scene, and I'm going to invite Christine back up, do this a little bit out of order, because I'd like everybody to hear this scene of when she first meets Beckett, who she claimed was really the love of her life.
That's when I noticed Sam. A kind of shock went through me. I might have shivered. He was sitting with his back closest to Joyce, lighting his pipe. I liked his high cheekbones, the green eyes, the distracted air as though he'd wandered into our party in the midst of a dream. Where have I seen him before, I wondered, because he looked familiar in that way a person can, someone you've known or know already that you'll love. He didn't look my way. He didn't return my stare. 5 years earlier, I might have accepted this as defeat and moved on, assuming I was rather ugly, rather brash, with the worn eyes of a mother, or found some other flaw. But now, as I felt my life starting anew, I couldn't look away. Even when it made him uneasy, I could see how he winced under my gaze. I thought of looking at those paintings in London. Looking at him, there was the same strange, unknowable element, something chaotic and rude. "Who is that young man?" I asked Helen when she came over to borrow a cigarette, leaning back. "Beckett?" she said, raising her eyebrows. "Bit young for you, no?" She told me he wanted to be a poet. He'd written a little he'd written a little chapbook on Proust that quite a lot of people liked. For now, he worked for Joyce as a kind of secretary. Then she lowered her voice. Lucia had been mad for him, she whispered, but he'd broken her heart. I kept staring at him. I noticed the way he held his body stiffly, apart from the others, and how he never really looked at anyone. He often appeared to be pondering a complicated question that he would probably never tell you about. His clothes were awful, French and too tight. He owned a single blue dinner jacket I'd eventually learn he was unaccountably attached to. How nice it would be to be beside a man who rarely spoke, I thought. All the men I'd been with, Lawrence, John, even Humphrey, whom I'd been sleeping with of late, who'd been giving advice about the gallery. All these men spent most of their time taking the attention, talking relentlessly. I would run to the garden and read Tolstoy just to hear my own voice. Bold as I was, I didn't have the nerve to reach over, to introduce myself, to even say hello. But I kept staring at him as a kind of dare. Will you look my way? I'm sure I had a slight devilish smile on my face, and someone watching me might think, well, she's trying to collect him, the way she collects sculptures that are odd or crooked.
The fireworks in the bedroom with Peggy and Beckett, and they hold up first in her hotel room, her fancy hotel room, and then he just can't bear that space, and then she has a friend who loans her a really shabby apartment that becomes their love nest for weeks on end, and she remains friends with Beckett even after they're no longer lovers, but he was certainly a very important person in her life. Now, we're nearly at the end here, and I wondered if each of you would like to say something lasting about your impression of the book and its effect on you. Doretta, will you start?
I think it was so interesting just thinking back to when Rebecca had signed this book deal, and that when I was waiting for the book, that I thought it was going to be so much more about Peggy and Beckett. But as I was reading and I was going through, I was just so delighted that it was just she wasn't defined by the men. That even though in the way that we might see her, that there are so many men, there's so many famous men, that Peggy herself, the spirit of Peggy, Rebecca just puts it so far forward that it's just the other people, they don't dim Peggy, because just she's so beautifully captured and we just are in her mind, and that it's just so lovely to just not have someone come out from something where they did all these amazing things, but then the first thing in their obituary will just go directly to the definitions of other people that she was in a relationship to instead of the accomplishments. And in this book, Rebecca really is just see the accomplishments, see how this woman changed the world that we live in and the art that we see in the books that we read. And that was just one of those things that just really gave me so much happiness.
Well, she reclaims Peggy Guggenheim's life for her in the telling of this story. Rosemary.
I guess what fascinates me is I don't know how many pages the book is, 350 pages, in the first person. That's very hard to pull off. And yet the world that Rebecca has created for Peggy Guggenheim is large. You feel the political shifting ground underneath. You feel the art world. You feel, and I think it's very important what you said, that there were many, many lovers. I wouldn't, I'm sure there must have been 100, right? I mean, and they were all part of her pleasure. She did hang on a little too long to Beckett. I actually met Samuel Beckett in Paris, and he was the most generous, lovely man. And I never saw him again. I mean, I didn't become a friend. It's just you were with that craggy look and that waiting for Godot's style. You didn't expect a man who was so warm and generous and friendly drinking a Guinness, right? But I was just. I think part of the power of the book is literally Rebecca's syntax. You just heard it in the piece that Carolyn read. That she keeps pulling you in it through humor, through, it's just a very marvelous book.
Adam?
Yeah. Just to pick up, Rosemary, on Beckett, I found myself, I think that those passages describing the two of them, just like constantly like reaching for my phone and Googling young Samuel Beckett, over and over again, and like pulling up images and being like, I was
How
just so,
hot he
really,
was.
It's great. Favorite passages. Late in her life, Peggy Guggenheim had a biographer, Jacqueline Wald, I think her name was. And Jacqueline posed a question to her, which I think is interesting and kind of summative in an attempt to kind of get at the core of her, how she perceived her life to be. And she said, art and people, which came first? Right? Like, was it about the collecting? Was it about the socializing? What is it about the friendships that you? And she said art, and I feel like I don't quite buy that. I think it's equal measure, and I feel like that's something that comes through in the book so strongly, is that the two are so intricately interwoven, and that these relationships and friendships and affairs with artists and writers all kind of were of a piece. Do you know what I mean? This was like a complete world that she constructed for herself, again, like with her own agency and centering herself in everything. And I just feel like that is the great achievement of the book, is to convey that in such a vivid way and completely change the way I think about Peggy Guggenheim as a person.
Well, and I think it changes the way we all think about Peggy Guggenheim, who's formerly just considered some kind of rich dilettante. And here we have somebody who is fully formed, entirely believable. You believe every word that comes out of Peggy's mouth. It's such an authentic piece of art itself, the novel. And just before I invite... and I'm sorry, I've just forgotten. Evelyn. I'm sorry, Evelyn, I just forgot your name. I want to draw your attention to the illustration on the front of the podium, if you can see that. It's of an adolescent Peggy with some of the dead birds around her from one of the debutante balls, wearing the suffragist banner. And a copy of that will be yours if you purchase copies of Peggy outside from the U of T bookstore, and that is drawn by Rebecca's daughter, Ada. So in a beautiful gesture of life imitating art, we have that wonderful illustration from Rebecca's daughter, Ada, and it's only available to all of you here this evening. So please be sure to treat yourself to a copy and one for a friend, because this book is really, really beautiful. And please come back up, Evelyn, and send us on our way.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, Adam, Rosemary, Doretta, and Janet, and Christine, and Stephanie, for this amazing evening. This was so fun. I don't know, it was fun for me, having read the book, to hear you talk about it, but I imagine it was fun for everybody, and you're dying to go get the book, so please do. It's outside in the lobby. And then just before we leave, I just wanted to tell you about some upcoming events. So on November 12th, we're going to have the Harold Innis lecture with Helga Stevenson, who's the former director of TIFF. And then on November 27th, we'll have the screening of Rice Boy Sleeps with actor Ethan Huang. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you again next time.